Now, a couple of weeks back, Indian announced a massive update to their Scout lineup with 5 new model variants that have been redesigned from the ground up. And no doubt, there are some significant improvements, but how do they stack up against the competition? Well, in this video, we'll go through the Scout Bobber spec by spec to see how it compares on paper and ultimately find out, could it be the best mid-cruiser on the market in 2024? Now, first up, let's deal with the thorny issue of the price, and the Indian comes in at £13,195, which is £100 less than the Harley-Davidson Nightster. It's also the exact same as the Triumph Bobber, which is another bike we'll compare it to in this video, but all of them are well over £1,000 more than the BMW R12, which looks to be the bargain of the group. So what do you get for your money? Well, the Scout Bobber gets a V-twin, which is of course the most typical engine configuration of this cruiser genre, although it is a fairly modern 60-degree liquid-cooled setup that can actually make some decent top-end power, so it's 105 horses at 7,250 RPM. Torque is also pretty healthy with 108 Nm made at 6,300 RPM, and so it's just a bit of an all-round bruiser, just like the previous generation. Least powerful of the bunch would be the Triumph Bobber at 77 horsepower, which might sound a little bit meager for a 1200cc parallel twin, but you've got to remember that it's massively tuned for torque, with a handy peak of 106 Nm made right down at 4,000 RPM, so this thing really pulls down low, and so if you love a torquey engine, then this is the one to go for. Now, the R12 has the potential to be the most impressive of the bunch, with a big peak torque figure of 110 Nm at 6,000 RPM, and that's despite being the only air and oil cooled bike of the group. But thing is, peak power is electronically limited to 95 horsepower to keep it restrictable down to A2 license compatibility. It's a big shame because the R12 retro equivalent gets the same engine, but it's totally uncapped, and it makes 109 horsepower peak, which sounds like a lot more fun. But still, the mid-range is super impressive on this bike, and all I would say against it is that it's just possibly the least cruisery sound and feel, being a boxer twin, and so potentially a bit of an acquired taste. Now, the Harley has the smallest capacity engine of the bunch at 975cc, which means it's down on torque and power, and I do remember having ridden it out on the press launch a couple of years back that it did lack a little bit in terms of soul and sound and vibes. On the plus side though, it is the lightest of the bunch by quite some stretch at 221 kilograms wet, and also with brakes from Brembo and Showa suspension, plus a slim 19-inch wheel at the front, it was actually quite a lot of fun on the sort of Spanish mountain roads. The only thing that perhaps detracted from that entertainment a bit was the throttle response, which is really choppy on and off regardless of what riding mode you're in, and so if you crack the throttle mid-corner just to get on the gas early, it sort of unsettles the bike and it feels like you're tense just before you open the throttle. And so yeah, it did become a bit wearying over the course of the day unless you smoothed it out a little bit with the clutch, but still, it's pretty light and quite a nimble bike. Now, the Triumph and the new Scout Bobber are both quite a bit more hefty, up around the 250 kilogram mark, and also they get the big bobberish tyres front and rear on 16-inch rims, so they're both not realistically going to be setting any lap records at the TT. And in fact, there can only be one winner in this category realistically, especially considering the price, and it has to be the BMW. It's almost as light as the Harley, it gets twin 4-piston radially mounted monoblock Brembo brakes on fairly big 310mm discs up front, Marzocchi suspension front and rear, and a decent amount of travel on the rear shock, which can be a rare thing in this category of bike. I've ridden it plenty recently, although my full review is yet to go up on this channel, but it's definitely a cruiser that can go. Now, before we get on to the next bike, I just want to say a massive thanks to today's video sponsor, and that's Cardo. Cardo make, in my opinion, the best comms headsets in the business, and in particular, we use their top-of-the-range Pack Torque Edge for all of our rides. Now, this thing is absolutely rammed with features, but what I think it does best is just getting the basics absolutely right. You've got brilliant audio quality courtesy of some JBL design speakers, excellent noise gating so you don't get loads of wind noise in the mic, which can be quite distracting, and also their dynamic mesh communication system means you can pair up to 15 riders in a group with up to a mile between each, and the more riders that join, the stronger the connection gets. Also, if somebody drops off, they automatically get heeled back into the group once they catch up, so there's no need to pull over and manually pair again. Genuinely, these headsets are absolutely fantastic and I can wholeheartedly recommend them, so do check out the link down in the description below to pick up yours. And you'll also find down there a discount code that's specifically for our viewers. So once again, a massive thanks to Cardo for their support. And with that, back to the bikes. Now look, if you're genuinely trying to choose between these 4 bikes, then there are 4 key things that you need to know about the ergonomics. Firstly, the seat height. The Scout Bobber is really quite low at 665mm, which makes it, in my experience of riding the previous generation, feel really sort of badass, but it also makes for a very chilled out riding experience. The Triumph and the Harley are somewhere in the middle, whereas the BMW is actually quite tall for a cruiser at 754mm, and so you feel like you can get on top of it a bit and muscle it around and take advantage of that well-spec'd chassis. Secondly, all of them come with a choice of different bar heights and either mid or forward foot controls, so you can get the riding position dialed into your exact taste, except the R12, which only gets mid bars and mid controls. Now I'm not sure why they've limited it on the handlebar choices. You'd think they'd want to make a few more quid out of the accessories catalogue, but you can see why you can't get the forward foot controls. It's just the fundamental laws of physics. Now thirdly, you've got to consider what you want out of the riding position and how much it's going to cost you to get what you want. The Indian comes with forward foot controls, for example, but it'll cost £400 to get the mid control conversion. The Triumph and the Harley, on the other hand, well, they come with mids as standard, and they'll cost 320 quid and 640 quid to convert to forward controls respectively. So with that said, if you're absolutely set on forward controls, the Indian gets you those as standard, whereas you'll have a 640 quid price jump up to the Harley for the same setup. And of course it works the other way as well if you've got your heart set on mids. Then, fourthly, if that is a word, there's the passenger seat situation. All of them come with a solo as standard for that super cool loner, don't need nobody kind of aesthetic. And with the Indian, the Harley and the BMW, you can spec up a passenger seat and pegs from the accessories catalogue. The odd one out here is the Triumph Bobber, and although that floating saddle is worthy of being mounted on the wall at the Tate Modern, it does mean that you can't get a passenger seat. Your only option is to go with a third-party company like Thornton 100, who make this fantastic looking passenger seat conversion, but you'll be paying over £4,000 for the pleasure. Or the other option, I guess, is to go with the Speedmaster. It's built upon the same platform as the Bobber, it's exactly the same price as well, but on the downside it really does have quite a different look to it, with much more of a classic vibe, and the riding position is much more upright with those swept back beach style bars. Honestly, with the ergonomics, all of these bikes have got their strengths and weaknesses here. The Indian is really low, but it is quite customizable. The Harley has options as well, but it is super expensive to convert to the forward controls. The Triumph is the most reasonably priced to convert, but it can't take a passenger. And the BMW is easy to get on with that high seat, but it has zero adjustability. So they're all going to have to get a B. Now, with regards to techie features, personally, I don't think it's particularly important for this genre of bike. I think they should feel a bit stripped back and old school. But look, it's 2024, and so of course there are plenty of options. What I like about the Indian though is that you can choose. The most simple, affordable version just gets ABS and an analog dash. Then 800 quid more gets you the limited version with traction control and some riding modes, as well as cruise control. And then for 1600 quid you can get their limited plus tech pack, which adds a round 4-inch color TFT display that opens up navigation, riding stats and phone integration, as well as keyless ignition. I really like that it lets you choose specifically how much tech you want, and you also feel like you're not paying for the stuff you don't need, and some of those components like the cruise control you can choose individually in the accessories catalogue. Now the standard Harley Nightster gets 3 riding modes, although as I've said they're all a bit abrupt on the throttle apart from the rain mode, but that feels super dull for quicker riding. But there is still traction control, ABS and engine braking management as standard, and while the dash is analog, you can pay another 1200 quid for the Nightster Special, and that one comes with a round TFT dash that gets you some connectivity features, along with cruise control, a passenger seat and pegs, a fairing and some fancier looking wheels. The Triumph Bobber it has to be said, has to be admired for its integrity in sticking to the brief. There's just an analog dash, there's no upgrades or connectivity or anything like that, but you do get a couple of riding modes to tame all that torque in the wet, as well as traction control, ABS, and a simple single push-button cruise control system as standard. The BMW though, well, you get 2 riding modes as standard with the admittedly quite corny names of rock and roll, but there's cruise control, lean sensitive traction control and ABS as standard, keyless ignition as standard, and then the option to upgrade to a cool looking little micro TFT dash for just 120 quid. So look, way more features than the rest of the bikes, and yet the starting price is the cheapest by a country mile. But ultimately, a large part of owning a cruiser is about image, and so which one of these bikes is the best looking? Well, in my opinion, I think both the Indian and the Triumph are pretty level and top of the tree, just because they've got the most cohesive styling jobs and plenty of attention to detail, and also there is something to be said for those big old chunky tyres. The BMW is a bit of an oddball, you won't see another cruiser looking like that, but I will say if you spec it up right with the fancy bits and the spoke wheels, it's still, in my opinion, quite a nice looking thing, if not totally conventional. Then bringing up the rear, and of course this is all my opinion, but I think it's probably the Harley. It is a bike that sort of replaced the Sportster, which was no longer viable from an emissions perspective, and while there are little references here and there, it just doesn't capture at all the vibe of the original, which was a great looking bike. Out of the 4, it's just the one that does the least for me in the 4 generating department. But with all that said, which bike is the winner? Well, if you give them 3 points for an A, 2 points for a B, and 1 point for a C, numerically that puts the Harley last at 10 points. The Indian and the Triumph are tied on 13. And the BMW is top on 15. And I think I'd say actually that's a pretty accurate depiction of how I'd place them, with the BMW clearly being the best in terms of price, spec, hardware, performance, tech. Although I will say there is one caveat, and that's the fact that visually and also in terms of the engine character, like I've said a few times, it's just not that typical of the cruiser genre. You don't have the option of that super stretched out riding position, and also it sits quite tall. Realistically, and bearing in mind I've still got to ride the new Scout Bobber, but looking at the specs and how they sit, this is going to be the most fun to ride. But if that's not a massive concern and what you really want is something that does do that classic cruiser burbling and growling and that low slung stance, then the Indian and the Triumph I think are more likely to hit the spot. As always though, I'd love to know which bike you choose, so do let me know down in the comments below, and I'll also leave my full review of the previous generation Scout Rogue on the screen now in case you haven't seen it already, so do give it a click and give it a watch. Hit subscribe as well if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on YouTube. Many thanks for watching today, and we'll catch you in the next video.